everyone, and welcome to another video. In this video, we will be talking about the Winsor Newton Designers Gouache introductory set containing 10 tubes of gouache. I have never worked with gouache before, but I've been seeing it around YouTube, so it got me curious and I got these paints on quite a good sale. Now, to my surprise, when I finally got into all the plastic packaging that was put on these paints, I found next to the paint tubes, of course, a booklet that Winsor & Newton put in there with a color chart, but also quite some useful information about color mixing and working with the medium, which is super handy if you are just starting out, which it is an introductory set, so couldn't hurt to include it. Really well thought of. So this is the range of gouache that Winsor & Newton offers. So they have a range of 80 colors and they've included all pigment information if you want it. Now let's get into the paints that we actually purchased, because we did not go for an 80 tube set. That would be way too much. Let's just start out with the basics. Again, the plastic packaging is also added on the inside, I guess to keep the tubes in place, but it's quite annoying to get off of the paints really, and it was a bit too much plastic in my opinion. They could do without. So here we have the 10 tubes containing 14 milliliters each of the gouache. Now you can see cool and warm versions of yellow, red, and blue, perfect for mixing, a green, that's a convenience color, and then a brown, a black, and a white. Starting off, we have the primary yellow, which is on the cooler side. It's made up of two pigments, pigment PY74 and PY138. Next up, we have Permanent Yellow Deep. This color is made up of one pigment, PY65. Let's see if we can get that sharp in there. Yeah, there we go. Next up is the Spectrum Red color. It is made up of two pigments, PBR25 and PR170. Then we have Primary Red, and this is a one pigment color, PR170, and as you will notice, the previous one, the Spectrum Red, is actually made up of the same pigment, just some brown added in there. Another primary color, Primary Blue, also one pigment, it is PB15. After that, we have a ultramarine blue in this set. It's just called ultramarine actually, sorry. And it is also one pigment, pigment PB29. Now for the only green in this set, we have Permanent Green Middle, and it has three pigments actually, the first one with three pigments, and it is the pigment PY3, PY74, and PG7. Our only brown or neutral in this set is the yellow ochre, and that consists of one pigment, and that is pigment PY42. And then we have our ivory black, And that is also a one pigment color. It is pigment PBK9. And the last one is zinc white, made up of pigment PW5. So there you have it. That's the contents of this introductory set of Designer's Gouache by Winsor & Newton. Now, before we get to the swatching, let's see what Winsor & Newton decided to add to this packaging as a little backstory. It's short but sweet. Designer's gouache colors are made from the finest pigments, offering vibrant, opaque watercolors with a smooth, matte finish. So let's see how that theory works in practice and get to the swatching. Now for the swatching, I'm using a flat brush, synthetic hairs, and a regular watercolor paper cold pressed. So if you see some texture in there or at the end when I'm showing you up close, that might just be due to the watercolor paper. And it is my understanding, later reading it online, that there are artists who prefer working on hot press or illustration board with gouache because it will give the smoothest finish and it is easier to reproduce it when you start printing your image or your illustration that you've made. Now, I was unaware of this at the time of swatching, so I just picked up a random leftover piece of watercolor paper cold press that I had lying around. It took me quite a while to figure out what the difference between gouache and acrylics was. So just a reminder or new information if you're not aware. Gouache and acrylics are similar in that they are opaque paints which you can thin with water to make them less opaque or a little bit more smooth when applying to paper. Now, I think that's where the similarities end because the differences between gouache and acrylic is that acrylic will dry and not be reactivatable with water because it will dry into a kind of plastic layer so water can't actually penetrate it anymore and reactivate the paint. Whereas gouache will still be activatable with water even after you've let your painting sit and dry completely. This makes it harder to layer paints with gouache because you can actually reactivate the layer underneath and mess up a layer that you found very pretty. On the other hand, it may be easier to rework it a little if you're not quite satisfied with a layer. Now, another difference between gouache and acrylic is the fact that gouache tends to dry matte, as we just saw Winsor & Newton describe about these paints as well. And then you have the acrylics, which tend to dry with a little bit more of a sheen to it. It's not super shiny, but it's definitely noticeable and way less matte than these gouache colors can get. Now you also have a bit of an overlap between watercolors and gouache because they can also both be made less opaque by adding water and thinned down. The difference, however, is the opacity of the paints. As you can see on screen right now, these paints are super opaque and the watercolors tend to be transparent. That's actually something you look for in watercolors, if it's super transparent or a little less transparent. But even if you find watercolors that are labeled as opaque, they don't really tend to be as opaque as the gouache paints. Now, as I'm swatching this white gouache, it is good to mention that it's hard to see on screen, but because it is so opaque, often white gouache will be used to add highlights to watercolor paintings. Artists also add traditional watercolors together with the white gouache to make a more opaque version of the watercolor that they have. We finished our swatches, and as you can see, it does what Winsor and Newton described. It dried matte and super opaque and vibrant. These are really good gouache paints, and I will actually be using them to create a painting in the next part of this video, so we can get a little bit more of a feel for these paints. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of looking at these Winsor and Newton gouache paints. If you like this video, consider leaving a like, a comment, or maybe subscribing to my channel. Stay tuned for part 2, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!